through mediation. She brings her heartfelt desire to create space for healing. Can we give a warm welcome to Kianna? Gabriella Ringwald Alves, they, is a critical media educator, organizer, media activist, and instructional designer based in unceded Lenape land, Staten Island, New York. She received her BA from Sarah Lawrence College, where she began exploring the use of media making as a tool to make straight the oppressive structures of colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. In 2023, G graduated from Teachers College Columbia University with an MA in Instructional Technology and Media, which focused on anti-racist, abolitionist, and transformational Indigenous pedagogical models and how to implement the theory into action. During her time at TC, Gabriella collaborated with Lenape Center to indigenize the curriculum for pre-K through second grade New York City learners on Manhattan to learn about her Indian Lenape presence and future. She is currently the Director of Education at Start Empowerment, where they build K-12 curriculum that promotes critical thinking, leadership, and organizing skills within the climate justice space. Please welcome G. Beautiful. I'm going to pass off to Kianna, and let's get started.
Yeah, thank you, Simon. So that's actually Kianna Minister. Hello, friends, relatives. My name is Kianna. I am a citizen of the Maori Nation. My homeland, as introduced earlier, is I'm from New Mexico, Southwest. I particularly grew up in the northwest corner of New Mexico in a town called Farmington, and that name has not been good these past days. If anybody has been paying attention to Indigenous news, one of our native students there had her barrier stripped from her and cut. There's a feather with a plume. And so that's the community I come from, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of that silence and how it kind of integrated into the equation of this project. First, I just want to explain why I'm here. So the title of this event is Kianna ToolKit Web of Relations. However, this toolkit was, of course, made in community. The inspiration behind this really came from me starting to venture into the world of education. So I started about 2020. I started developing this media content online, educational content, and this educational content came a lot from things I was doing within school. I mean, time, okay, let's see what digital media activism is all about. And so I would take papers I wrote about federal community law, these topics that were really important, that I thought were important to for everyone to know and just create something that was digital and informative. So I started utilizing my social media platform to create those different types of content. And over time, I've been able to connect with a lot of people, including people at Start Empowerment, who will be talking here later on in about 30-ish minutes. But also connecting to other Indigenous organizers and activists across Turtle Island. So crazy, I have so many people Aboriginal in Australia, New Zealand. It's a really interesting field to connect, and I think as Indigenous peoples, many of us are in diaspora, disconnected from our communities, and for us, social media has become a really good platform to connect. Of course, there are limitations to what we can do in social media, as far as progressive activism goes. I heard conversations earlier about women's anxiety. So there's those things that follow, but that's sort of where my journey came from, just creating some sort of visual media that makes things easy to learn, especially for people who don't really get most of their information from the academic sphere. I found one thing being in academia for now like 5 years is that information about our own communities is so selective. We don't have access to that. I know, like, I didn't even know I was living in a border town in Farmington. So I left and learned what a border town was through scholarship that was there. I had to have like people explain to me about my experience, and in many cases, that I was the other one. I had to explain to my professors who I would choose like topics. Right, I got settled in law, I would go into like political science courses, and professors would, what is this? Like, what does this mean? Like, what does Indigenous law mean? So I just wanted to hopefully, through my work, become not necessarily a bridge for white people, but a bridge for Indigenous communities to get access to this information. And this is something, we're learning, and, coming from a community that is really violent to its own Indigenous students. It's even more important now than ever. So the climate justice angle in my introduction to climate justice is, I think as Indigenous peoples, I don't think we're ever disconnected from climate justice. Honestly, I don't think we're ever disconnected from any issue. I feel every single issue I can think of, be that homelessness, poverty, food insecurity, Indigenous peoples are up there, every single one. Especially when it comes to climate justice, like our way of being is tied to the land. If we're not taking care of the land, or if we're not taking care of the land can take care of us. And at the same time, we're having a lot of these other different entities, be that fossil fuel companies, other people telling you there's clean energy, like different forms of hydrogen that are supposed to be cleaner. We're getting fed these lies all the time. People trying to tell us this is how we should be living, when in reality, those ways of living have never been true. So that was sort of the introduction to climate justice and why I chose to, why did I choose to work with Urban Indigenous Collective? I think being, 70% of Indigenous, like over 70% of Indigenous peoples live in urban communities. I think Urban Indigenous Collective has really been great at, I came to New York and I come from like a community that had a lot of Indigenous people, and I came here and there was nobody. And I think Sutton and Ariel created such a really good space and community to talk about those experiences of leaving home and to be able to build spaces that operate outside of dangerous institutions. So I mentioned earlier, everything's just wild where I'm coming from. Like, I expected to totally go home and like relax, and then I realized the day I come home, there's going to be a rally for the students who rights were violated, and I just came from a school that was rated by the NYPD, so it's been a crazy month, but this space has been so helpful. I think man who's in the audience has been so supportive of everything. Of course, Lila, Brian, and Sutton as well. And I also think what Sutton and Ariel represent so well is the power of Indigenous women, and of course Afro-Indigenous women. For me, like when I look at climate justice leaders, like women are the people protecting our earth. I think when we had our missing and murdered Indigenous relatives march, Sinead talked about women being the water carriers, caring for the communities. And so when it came to them, they automatically became felt like a source of inspiration, but also people I trusted and wanted to work on this project with. So the name of this toolkit is called Web of Living Relations. I didn't come up with this name actually. I think Marianne and Trudy. Yeah. Originally, it was just going to be something pretty bland, like climate justice for missing and murdered Indigenous peoples. But as I once I saw the name and their little description of what the project was, I was like, that's exactly what I was trying to explain, and they were able to put it in words. So the biggest theme I wanted to sort of capture with this is climate change is linked to the health of people, all people. Of course, living people have that special and intimate relationship, but how we take care of the land affects everybody. And I think talking about climate change is so important now with the issues that we're dealing here without here in Shanghai and the places everywhere else. I've been working in the environmental climate justice space for the past, like 3 or 4 years. And I've met at least every type of environmental and climate justice organizer that has been. Of course, I've met a lot of white environmentalists who like to police indigenous practices, indigenous ways of protecting the earth. I've also met radical climate activists who are willing to blow up oil fields, willing to go to jail to prevent the building of pipelines. So those are just really good experiences I've been able to draw from and to take with me. But one thing I just want to start off with first is that right now we're going through a period of time where a lot of activists, climate, environmental justice organizers, and people in general who call themselves activists are ignoring things that are happening to our Palestinian relatives, mainly because they either are refusing to see the connections of their work to that or willingly choosing to ignore it. And when it comes to the topics of climate justice, like what we're seeing right now, like war, imperialism is the biggest contributors to what we are seeing to the devastation of this planet. Not only is it like, of course, people, at least estimate 30 to 40,000 Palestinians have been killed, but these bombs have released so much CO2 emissions that are destroying our atmosphere at the same time. How are we going to say, like, it's climate justice activists that is not affecting us? Similarly, we have situations within the Congo where we're building a lot of coal mining, and at the same time, these bad labor practices where they're having at least 40,000 Congolese children mining these places. At the same time, our relatives in Hawaii are living. There's so many military bases, different testing that have harmed the water. Additionally, by the same people that are living in there, there's this report, one of the people I work with on this ToolKit showed me, was that Native Hawaiian women were also experiencing high rates of violence due to these military bases being built within those areas. And that's just one thing I wanted to just start off saying, like climate justice, our responses to climate change are so important to this planet and taking care of each other. The development of this toolkit, so I'm just going to tell you this little first page and stop at Staples and everything. So here we have a picture of whether the regulations kind of just for missing and other indigenous peoples. So the development of this toolkit first just started off with me just getting information just from other people. So it basically started with me just emailing people and having conversations. So I have a lot of academic mentors, researchers at the University of Michigan, Julissa Lopez, now a doctor, as well as Jamie Delato. They're both Indigenous and people I worked with over the summer to do research on Indigenous policy, but their research looks at psychology, and in particular, psychology surrounding issues of missing and murdered Indigenous women. And so one conversation I had with Jamie is what she talked about in the community of just thinking about why are we so irresponsive to the missing and murdered Indigenous people's crisis. One thing that I thought was really interesting, something I didn't go into this toolkit necessarily, but something I've been keeping in the back of my mind is empathy and apathy we feel for Indigenous women who go through these issues of therapy, blackmail, experiencing sexual assault. Why is it that we don't feel, why is it many people don't feel that connection to help them? And one thing that she has been finding through her research is that people, like the victim blaming of Indigenous women when it comes to missing and murdered Indigenous crisis is so bad. Indigenous women are blamed for their condition, blamed for their way of life. And as I was thinking about that, I started also thinking about the histories of how Indigenous people have always been blamed for their condition. We were always blamed for being accommodated. We're always blamed for, in any way, if we were resisting or if we got homeless, we're blamed for the outcomes for that as well. So I'm something I kept in mind. Another one of my friends, they worked in the museum, and usually they worked in curating. They were also a scholar, Dartmouth, and their name was Michaela. And our conversations were really interesting. I think she gave me a really good perspective. I was thinking about in the development of this toolkit, and that was looking at imperialism. How is it that the military contributes to issues of disability Indigenous women, but also the military contributing to the degradation of the planet, climate change? And she's had really good insight in them. She gave me like a plethora of different resources that I'm including in this toolkit for people to look at. I know there are many instances to forget our Native Hawaiian relatives, Pacific Islander relatives. As I've been seeing after the fires that have happened, the lack of resources and responses after that has not been good, and that was also something I looked into. And then another conversation I had was with my friend Sarah Allen. They're now going to be taking an environmental master's program at the University of Michigan as well. And one thing that they really helped me sort of look at is on the scholarship side. Kyle White from the University of Michigan, he does a lot of work around environmental justice, but also integrating Indigenous philosophies and beliefs in those intersecting ideas. And that also was something that I began to look into this toolkit. I myself, I like looking at Indigenous philosophies, I like Indigenous scholarship. I really do believe they capture a facet, not only of academia, but just thinking about systems of governance, thinking about medicine, thinking about architecture, thinking about all these different connections that the silos of academia really like to disconnect and segregate. So that was also a lens I went into with this toolkit. So next, I'm going to just do a walkthrough of the ideas. So the goal of this toolkit really was, it's not just a couple things. I listed out a couple bullet points. So I'll read from the toolkit itself. So first is asking, what is climate justice for missing and murdered Indigenous peoples? So climate justice is a civil rights issue. It describes the connections between the climate crisis and social, racial, and environmental factors that disproportionately impact certain communities. This results in an uneven distribution of responsibility for climate change, and that endangers the planet and frontline communities, especially Indigenous peoples who have been stewards of the land since time immemorial. Indigenous peoples whose well-being and culture rely on the land have been victims of forced displacement, genocide, and other forms of removal that have always included the brutalization of land ecosystems. Climate justice for missing and murdered Indigenous peoples addresses this violent history while accounting for the ongoing practices that violate the health of this planet's biodiversity. So the purpose and use of this toolkit is I really wanted to disrupt popular narratives of violence, of course by centering Indigenous perspectives and community-led efforts that resist further colonial suppression. When I was thinking originally about this, it was at the time that, I forget the movie, the last one, Killers of the Flower Moon came out. And one of the big central themes of that movie was, that I think was kind of glossed over, but as Indigenous peoples was something we immediately thought was the violence against Indigenous peoples. Of course, there was a violence against Indigenous women, but we saw men and women being killed. But one of the leading causes with that was the white men in the movie, they wanted rights to the oil. They wanted to be able to have that oil to gain wealth and to, of course, be above Indigenous peoples. And I think about that region of what has happened since then. We look at Oklahoma, like, Oklahoma, Texas, and Florida fascinate me. I think just the politics in those areas are just, I don't know what to say. It's not something I agree with, and I think most of us don't agree with it, but just looking at the outcome of like what would have happened like if Indigenous land stewardship of the Osage wouldn't have stayed. What would the land look like? What would the extraction of resources look like? Would we be in a stage of development where we're utilizing natural resources in the right way? Capital is being equally distributed. So that was sort of like what I wanted to say. It's like we have, and at the same time in that movie, we have white film directors, writers, narrating these stories of violence, narrating our own histories. I know there are many people that, especially at the Osage leadership, that agree, but one thing I was just thinking of, like, I think the story would have been so much different if we had Indigenous writers in that. I think we would have heard Molly's, Lily Gladstone's character's voice shine more. We would have heard her perspective. As Indigenous peoples, it hurt a lot seeing her, just the emotional torture we witnessed throughout. Mainly because white audiences can't necessarily picture that history, but also like it was a lived reality for many of us. For me, I saw my aunts, I saw my grandmas, just that look of being in pain but not being able to show it. So that's what I took away, and I just really want Indigenous perspective to shine in whatever way possible. So that was my hope with this ToolKit, is to disrupt that violence that I saw. And so once I kind of went through that portion, I contacted the Urban Dishes Collective, who said yes to collaborating with me. My aim for this was to, of course, provide clarity on the complexity of the missing and murdered Indigenous persons crisis, and an analysis of why Indigenous peoples continue to endure disproportionate violence. 2, bridge Indigenous studies and community knowledge, data sovereignty, to the climate justice movement. And 3, be an educational resource for Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities to learn about the issue and take action. So the first portion of this toolkit is, I would say, like a history. It's real. I was talking the other day with a friend about Indigenous histories, and they were like, "Are you a history fan?" I'm like, "No," and they're like, "You seem to write about it a lot." So, like, in a way, like I am. But I also think when it comes to talking about issues of Indigenous peoples, there's a really big emphasis on the contemporary, or the claim that there is a contemporary. One thing that I really enjoy about Indigenous studies is that there is no contemporary. Time is altogether. The issues that our ancestors face are issues of today. The issues that we're facing were issues back then as well. When it comes to our systems and practice and belief, all of it is all of it is on the same scale and all of it is linear. So when people are like, why do you always talk about history? Well, history is who we are, it's what made us and what is continuing to happen. So in saying that, one thing that I always find fascinating about people that talk about wanting to help Indigenous communities, wanting to be in community with Indigenous peoples, is they neglect the fact that we have experienced genocide, that we're enduring it. And that is, of course, stemming from settler colonialism. In many environmental justice, climate justice spaces, I think many people are afraid of the word land back, mainly because that means they have to talk about settler colonialism. That means they have to talk about ways that they benefit off of the displacement and genocide of Indigenous peoples. So that's one thing I just really wanted to preface. We need to talk about settler colonialism. We don't talk about it enough. We need to talk about the history. We need to talk about it now. We need to talk about what it would mean for the future. So I feel settler colonialism is such a buzzword. So what does it actually mean? Settler colonialism is a system of oppression created by genocide and colonialism, or the forced control and occupation of other peoples and land, where its ultimate goal is to remove and erase Indigenous peoples. This goal has greatly influenced the treatment of Native communities, contributing to issues like the missing and murdered Indigenous peoples crisis. And what settler colonialism actually reveals is the use of violence towards Native people. So in this case, violence is a tool to maintain settler society. And this concept is best explained by scholar and writer Elizabeth Copeland, Dakota Crook-Sioux, and Anti-Indigenism in Modern America. So in this novel, Copeland utilizes the term anti-Indianism to describe the ongoing violent conflict between settlers and Indigenous peoples that produce structures in society that monitor the presence, actions, and freedoms of Native communities. All of this stemming from settler colonial violence. One thing that I really found helpful of visualizing settler colonialism, or at least when I'm being able to teach it to others, is having different visuals. So I've included different charts. One of them actually came from Austin. But it really talks about the foundation. It really just, I wish I could have put the slides, but the chart's really small. You can see it, the little triangle. But it's imagining settler colonialism within the foundations of empire. So of course, the United States is the empire. So when the foundations of the United States, I took like settler colonialism. I imagine that as, I think the best explanation of settler colonialism comes from Patrick Wolf, who's an anthropologist. And what it describes is first, settler colonialism is the elimination of the native, the elimination of Indigenous peoples. But what does that mean? So in this, it's a really jargon-heavy text, but I could try to explain it the best I can. But what it's explaining is that what happens when you have settlers come to this land, in order for settlers to create this land, they needed justification. And that justification, of course, came from religious beliefs. So we have religious beliefs that manifest destiny, religious beliefs of terra nullius, doctrine of discovery, anything that gave legitimacy to be able to remove Indigenous peoples was something that in theory we want. But the creation of Indigenous peoples needed to be made. When people talk about being Indigenous, talk about this and that, one of the first things they ask, one thing I always try to preface is that Indigenous peoples, Native American, those are all political terms. We don't, if we were to go pre-settler colonialism, we wouldn't be calling ourselves Native American, we would be saying we're Indigenous peoples. This term was created in order for there to be an othering. If you guys have read Edward Said's Orientalism, you're creating an other. You had to be able to distinguish yourself of who thought and who didn't. So when we talk about Indigenous people, when we talk about Native Americans, they needed an other link. They needed to make sure that whoever was going to be able to go to the land, it can't be Indigenous peoples. So that was written into law, through that through Dr. Discovery, as I mentioned earlier, Shanolius. They needed to be able to create this political identity for Indigenous peoples. And that's always something I think we just need to remember as we're going along, as we call ourselves Indigenous people and Native American, that our identity, it sucks, but our identity is political, and we just need to be mindful of how we're navigating different spaces when we're using those terms. But anyway, going back to love. Once we have that creation of the Indigenous person and the creation of the Native, what happens after Indigenous people's harvests? They need a labor, and of course that comes with slavery. So with slavery came capital, building wealth, building down economic stance, and what happens with Indigenous peoples from that. And this kind of like, when I first read about it, kind of like just broke my heart. Mainly because it's true, and what he says is that as long as Indigenous peoples remain, there will always be a counter to settler legitimacy to land rights. I think, well, which sucks. As I was thinking about it, I was like, in many ways, like, that's true. That's why you have so many tribes refusing to be recognized, refusing to have their land being built having pipelines and other forms of development there. They're resisting this ultimate goal of building capital and controlling land and in other words, settler society. So that's the main gist of this argument, and something that I mentioned throughout this. But again, going back to the missing of our Indigenous peoples crisis, I talked earlier about the brutalization of land has always included the brutalization of Indigenous peoples. So in this first section, I give a historical outline of that violence, and of course I talk about when Christopher Columbus came on here, but I also talk about other forms of violence that resulted from that. So I talk about the conceptions of land, how we envision land. In my sophomore year of college, we had to read John Locke, we had to read John Rousseau, many of these political theorists who basically started to define land rights, define land ownership. So John Locke in particular, in the Treatise of Government, land rights were defined by competency, and Indigenous peoples were ruled as like savages, ruled as people who were fit to rule land because they weren't destroying it and actively building on it. So that's another form of violence we have. And then I also included scholars' work who I found really instrumental into talking about violence on the land. So the first one I included is actually my friend Eva. Her dad is a professor at Yale, and he wrote a book called Violence Over the Land. And in the book he says, Indigenous body is pain, Indigenous body in pain is the ultimate symbol of colonial progress and modernity. Indigenous land laid waste is its territorial corollary. I mentioned like a couple minutes ago about the ultimate goal of settler colonialism being the removal of Indigenous peoples, and the state of Indigenous peoples being maintained, as Black Hawk says, is progress. It's progress towards that goal. So that's what he's communicating here. And then I also included a Columbian professor, Audrey Simpson. She's an anthropology professor at Columbia University. She's Kamalaki Mohawk. And so she says in her book, or in her essay, States of Land, Feminist scholars have argued that Native women's body were to settler eye like land, and as such, in the settler mind, the Native woman is rendered unrapeable because she was like land, matter to be extracted from, used, solely taken from, over and over again. Something that is already violated and violable in a great march to accumulate surplus to be called production. And so from that essay, I also created a sort of timeline of violence that we see against Indigenous women over time. And it's a lot. I think it was more, it's something that I know, like deep down, but actually going into it and reading about it and having to create a timeline and how contemporary it was. Indigenous women have always been used for political gain, for the brutalization of Indigenous communities overall. Of course, we see that within Christopher Columbus's voyage, but we also see it in wars against Indigenous peoples. So like the Quebec War, Native women were deliberately targeted. I mean, it even comes up within the last couple of decades when Native women were under forced sterilization. Earlier we talked about the stealing of Indigenous children. Native women have always been the barriers of this pain and of this violence, and it affects the entire Indigenous community. I also I studied political science in undergrad, so I also get the policy lens of how climate change and climate impacts and missing and murdered Indigenous women have hurt Indigenous communities. And of course, I wanted to connect that to how the dispossession of Indigenous peoples or dispossession of Indigenous peoples from land legitimizes the violence they're subjected to. I talk about the Indian Removal Act, and of course, the Indian Removal Act, which gave way to the Trail of Tears, allowed there to be violence in order to displace Indigenous peoples. There was also the Dawes and Act, and then all the way up until only a couple decades ago, the Indian termination policies, where they had removed jurisdiction of land reservations and encouraged Indigenous peoples actually to assimilate into urban regions. And there's another factor that I want to talk about within the history, which is the dehumanizing of Indigenous peoples. And violence includes, violence is predicated on dehumanization. I think we see that more than ever just take a look at Instagram and look at Palestine and Indigenous peoples. Many of the people argue, and I think we know this inherently, argue that if you're a savage, if you have done things against settler society, that you're automatically agree. Okay, thank you. I was getting that. You're automatically susceptible to that violence. So that's the first portion of this. And now we go into the second portion of where we start making the connections to climate change, making the connections of what is happening. So this one addresses the question of how does climate change connect to missing and murdered Indigenous peoples? So I argue and say that climate change profoundly captures the inextricable link between the land and Indigenous peoples. Not only are Indigenous peoples the most susceptible to the negative impacts of climate change, but they are also subject to violence and solutions that falsely address the climate crisis. Moreover, the prioritization of profits over people leads to negative outcomes for the environment and displace Indigenous peoples forcefully or through the degradation of land resources. Fossil fuel industries are also responsible for the trafficking and violence against Indigenous women. Transient workers in these industries occupy space in the legal system where they are not held accountable for their actions. This leaves Indigenous communities vulnerable to the violence caused by those actions, which accelerate climate change alone. So in this section, I have a little bit of graphs, first explaining what climate change is, what causes it. And I think one thing we need to emphasize that, I think a lot of people who deny climate change are like, oh, like the planet is supposed to be getting warmer. Yes, like that is true, but not at this rate. So climate change, I have like a definition, there's like a graph in here, but for those of you who have a sense of climate change but doesn't know exactly what it means, I define it here as, so climate change describes the unnatural shifts in temperature and weather patterns that are dangerous for Earth's biodiversity. This is caused by fossil fuels, so coal, oil, and gas, which are the largest contributors and are all a result of human activities that release greenhouse gases. And the World Health Organization states that 3.6 billion already live in areas that are highly susceptible to climate change. And according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, since its systematic scientific assessments began in the 1970s, the influence of human activity on the warming of the climate system has evolved from theory to established facts. And a couple things I talk about here is connecting settler colonialism to climate change. One of the biggest books that have really helped me connect this, and I talked a little bit about it on the Start Empowerment's social media page, is I'm blanking on the name, but it's a T scholar, and it's called Pollution is Colonialism. And what it's describing is we as humans, we can adapt. If we drink a certain amount of water with some bacteria, we're fine. We can moderate that, we can tolerate that. But there comes this certain impact of if uranium is to weaken water, that's something we can't drink. But we need to ask, why was that uranium there even in the first place? So I'm from New Mexico. I come from the Southwest. I had relatives who were impacted by uranium mining spills, which affected our water, affected our livestock. But why were those uranium mines there? They were there to build nuclear weapons, to build weaponry during World War II. And this was all by the U.S. government. So it's talking about that. That's what that portion of that book is talking about. And then the second half is the solutions. What are we doing to help the planet, and how are those solutions not actually solutions? So they talk about it through the development of plastic pollution. But the biggest thing that they emphasize is that in the climate change sphere, when people are talking about these topics, they're always talking on the scale of harm. And they think about harm reduction. And in those conversations, it's always reducing harm, never eliminating it or wanting to get rid of it. Same thing when we talk about climate change. We're always saying, let's keep reducing it, but we'll come up with cleaner solutions, but it's never we'll get rid of it. We're gonna stop it. And that's exactly the same thing as well in the regarding Indigenous people's crisis. Okay, how are we gonna help? Oh, let's build better broadband signals so we can, let's build better broadband internet signals so you can get Amber alerts faster. But we're still gonna let the men get away with it in the law system. How does that work? So that's what I wanted to connect to. We're experiencing that same limitations of accountability, both in the climate justice space and also in other Indigenous women. Okay. There's also really cute graphs I have on here. You guys can take a look at them later. And this one I found probably the most helpful looking at connecting settler colonialism and the missing and murdered Indigenous women's crisis. So I really suggest you look at this after. It's a really neat chart. So. And I also created my own extraction chart to explain the removal of Indigenous peoples, the connections of the extractions of resources, and also when we talk about, if you guys have not heard the term or heard of the situation of man camps. So man camps are extractive industries, businesses that establish natural resource extraction projects, aggravate the problem by establishing temporary housing for large numbers of non-Indigenous peoples, primarily male workers, on or around Indigenous land. So this is another chart I made. You guys should check it out. And then I also create, and I'm still finishing this up, but I'm developing my own maps and also doing a lot more research on on extraction sites. So I would list I have a map of all of the different tribal reservations, and then on this side would be all of the different extraction sites. And so what I was seeing is that many of the sites of extractions, this is like oil, coal, different mining, they're either on Indigenous land or right outside, right on its borders. And so we see that in every instance. And so I was just connecting those together. And interestingly, the state that I found that had the most active mines and sources of extraction is actually Utah. And one thing that also was really interesting is that some of those extraction sites were under the water resources, or right next to all of these water resources that tribes would be using. I also take a look at different pipelines throughout the United States, or so-called United States, and seeing how they're all connected, which states they're going through. And this kind of came out of an oil spill we had back in my home region, Ship Rock, New Mexico. And there was an oil spill, and through that, as people didn't know what was underneath their own land, and so I wanted to just create a chart this is all going under Indigenous land. And then the last thing I really end with this section is talking about man camps. And I feel this is probably the best, really representative of climate change and the lack of accountability for victims that are missing and murdered from Indigenous communities. So I gave a definition of man camps earlier, but this really came out of a study from North Dakota. It was a really profound study showing the linkage of the extraction, the fracking formation, where they're extracting oil, and they were building these temporary housing sites for the workers to come in and come out. We define them as transient workers, and they would come up to these spaces, and during this time, as they were there, many Indigenous women started experiencing high rates of violence, and many people just said, oh, it's like a growth in population, but no, it wasn't. It was these transient workers who were there. And many of these reports went up to government, state, local, even up to UN bodies to describe the violence that they were facing. And in those conversations that they were having, you heard things of victim blaming, of course, but it was also the lack of legal integrity the system has to help solve this issue. So those transient workers occupy legal realm and space that doesn't hold them accountable, and that comes as a result of how we think about conservation, how we think about tribal law. It is complicated, and I don't have all the answers to that. But what really was happening is that within our law, and we go into this history of policy here as well, but just to simplify as we get to the Q&A portion of everything, in that system of law, we have, so of course, Indigenous peoples have their own federal law. And there's different court cases that establish Indigenous tribal or Indigenous, federally organized Indigenous peoples have their own systems of government that allow them to develop things on their own land, say what goes on and what does not. And one of that is through judicial process, the processing of different legal criminal activity. And that relationship is established between the federal government and Indigenous tribes themselves. And out of pretty much court case, but it's in there somewhere, but a court case had pretty much said that Indigenous peoples cannot prosecute non-Indigenous non-Indigenous peoples in general. And this had just basically allowed people to get away with things. And it comes to that thing I talked about earlier, like blaming Indigenous people for their own condition. Okay, we're going to give you a legal system, but you can only prosecute your own people. You can only police your own people. And it's same thing with like when it comes to issues of climate change. We'll give you, in quote, freedom and informed consent, but we won't exactly outline what that means and how it goes. But this is just a brief summary of everything. There's so much I didn't get to talk about, but those were the main things I just wanted to address within the toolkit. There's just a lot of things. A lot of things I was trying to talk through this and develop it, but I was just really thankful to get input from other people that the urban Indigenous collective work with this. So the second portion of this, let me do a ton of checks on what it is. Okay, cool. No, I think this is perfect. I wanted to just have people learn about environmental work that is happening here, not Tolkien, but also happening within the East Coast region, and getting just different perspectives. I'm really involved in the education space. I do a lot of education policy, and I know Gabriella also is involved in that. So the question I just wanted to ask is, what is the work that you're doing here? Why are you here? Thank you so much. If it's okay, could you quickly just give Kianna what else? So hi everybody, my name is Gabriella. I'm the Director of Education at Start Empowerment. We are a nonprofit youth organization where we really try to bridge the gap in climate education between education and action, and making sure that students are provided with really hands-on experiential learning projects. And so we are a little bit of everywhere. We have essentially 2 home bases in Lenape-Hoking, in Manhattan, North, and also in Texas. And we are doing a lot of different kinds of educational work with these spaces. But we are also hoping to expand and make sure that we are incorporating all of the different perspectives and all of the essential place-based knowledge of different peoples in those places. And so essentially we really work with students to make sure that they are empowered, guided, supported, but are mostly leading the way. And that's something that, we've built our curriculum around and continue to really work towards. So we have a lot of different initiatives going on. We also want to make sure that we're hearing from teachers, making sure that this curriculum is working well in the classroom, that students are able to, go beyond just like understanding these concepts of science, because that is a colonial thing in itself. That is a harm. And so we want to make sure that we are incorporating Indigenous perspectives of the place where these students are. They're hearing from Lenape people if they're learning about right? So they're getting a whole intersectional approach in this work, and it's not just for K-12 students, it's also for our community and making sure that our community is fed as well. So we also host community events. Every month we do an Earth Month convergence where Kianna actually spoke at our last one. And we have 3 workshops and food, and it's a way for us all to meet each other and interact with each other and know who our fellow comics are in our spaces. And it's something that, again, we're continuing to build as we're a very small team, and I'm very lucky to have Kianna on that team as well. And yeah, we're continuing to do this, we're continuing to build out, trying to reach these schools while also recognizing that schools are growing spaces, are places that continue to perpetuate harm, continue to erase people, both the people in history books or not history books, and also the students. And so we know how important it is that we are in the classroom, trying our best to make sure that students feel respected, honored, seen, but also, again, empowered to be the ones making those changes and feeling guided to their own revolutions in their community spaces. One of the reasons I really wanted G to be on this panel representing Start Empowerment is because the ToolKit is educating. It's education based. And that's not only the work I've been on, but I feel like I really wanted to relieve labor from Indigenous peoples as much as possible. And if that's through providing education and having people just look things up on their own without having to ask an Indigenous person about the trauma, like willing to give those resources for that. And we have another panelist online. Could you just explain your work a bit?
Sago, hello, can you hear me? Hi, can you hear me? Because I don't hear anything. Yeah, I
Yeah,
can't
you can
hear
hear
you.
us.
Okay, now I can hear you.
Sorry, we're muted so that it doesn't reverb for the audio, but we can hear you.
Well, I
Which
think when
is
you're muting though, I can't hear like anything Kiana's saying.
okay.
Can you ask the question?
Yeah. Just
Yeah, I was just asking, could you just explain a little bit about yourself and your work?
Sure. Sago sa wagwego gawanias to yungyat sa wagata hiuni kanya kahaga ni wagahon jodo dano akuzas na ni dawageno nana ua wan hizalade yoskohele skitalo dano nyamako ji wandu angeni tala nua wan hizalade. Hello everybody, my name is Gobaniasta. I am the Wolf Clan from the Iroquois Confederacy of the Kanien'kehá:ka people of the Flint. I am currently on our ancestral homelands in Schoharie Valley up near Albany, New York. We're on a 60-acre work and berry farm on an historical ancestral Turtle Clan village of our people. And I'm also the co-executive director of the Waterfall Unity Alliance. And the mission of our non-for-profit is to build alliances across movements and work with other allies and different Ungwehue people. And for all of you who don't know the word Ungwehue, which translate to the original beings of these lands. And so, like going back to what Kianna was talking about earlier, as far as the labels and the colonialism and how we've had to kind of accommodate the non-Ungwehue people and using terminology like calling ourselves Indigenous, Aboriginal, First Nations, all of that as part of my reclaiming myself and who I am as a Kanien'kehá:ka woman, and also to teach other Ungwehue people that, we don't have to accommodate for being who we are. And so I don't identify as any of those terms. And I'm not Indigenous. I'm not, Aboriginal, First Nations. I am Ungwehue. the original beings of these lands, and that's what we all are. And so right now we are, like I said, on this berry farm, and we're in the process of rematriating our homelands and creating space for our people to come home. In regenerative agriculture, we're working in revitalizing our teachings and being on the land, because we can, really relate to a lot of the things that Kianna's talked about, as far as industry and being so close to our reserve lands that they've put us on. And where I come from in Akwesasne, which is about 5.5 hours from where you are right now, we're surrounded by one of the biggest Superfund sites in North America. And so our lands and our waters are heavily polluted with PCBs and a lot of different other pollutants and really just nasty stuff. So at one point we relied heavily on our waterways to fish and to trap and all of that. And now all of our animals and whatnot are contaminated, as well as our lands and our waters. And so one of the biggest goals for the farm that we're on now is to be able to grow clean food and send back home to our communities. And, and also that progress part, being on a conventional farm and kind of totally rematriating it and turning it into a living farm again, because that our farm too has been heavily polluted with pesticides, herbicides, Roundup, all that stuff. And so we've spent the year just letting those lands heal, reconnecting with our ancestors that were there, that once occupied those lands, and just really singing to the land and being in ceremony. And my children are there, and another family is there. We have a language immersion center happening, and it's really picked up. The children are doing all land-based teachings, all on the farm. We're also into the biodynamic farming, and just really just getting off that hamster wheel. And it's been a beautiful journey, because, we are the land. And environmental justice to me is, when we heal the land, we heal ourselves. And so when I talk about environmental justice, I talk about the journey back to self, because of what colonialism and residential schools and all of that has taken away from our people. It's crucial that our people return to our original homelands and reconnect with our mother and begin that process to just kind of, just fall off and just live and be present and learn to re-regulate our nervous systems and really tap into who we are as original beings. And that's the work that I'm doing right now. So thank you, Kianna, for having me. I can't hear again, I'm sorry. I still can't hear her.
You can speak.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
I just wanted to say, one of my first climate march in the city, I actually ran into you. Do you remember that? In
Yeah.
New York?
Yep.
So we have a history. It's a weird history, but I've always. I think our family has always admired the strength you've given, and also the kindness you have, but also the care you've shown to your own children. I think through the lineages and schools that you decided land-based teachings. That's something that I always talk about from my parents back home. So Marvin and Tamara, we always talk about that. So that's something that we just really think is inspirational, and we really appreciate all the kindness you've shown our family throughout the the past decade or so. Yeah, that's how long we go back. But earlier, I don't think you described this work in your bio. You mentioned, you being a mother but also being a doula. Like, how do you see that relationship intertwining with environmental justice?
I'm really sorry. Like I was saying, the mic is a little bit muffled. Can you repeat that first part?
Yeah. Can you hear this better?
That's better, actually.
So my question was that, as a mother, and also in your bio, you mentioned doing a lot of work about being a doula. How do you see that interconnecting with your environmental justice workers, taking care of the land and the journey back to the self?
Yeah, so like even with that, that's environmental justice, having been able to have babies at home, being able to have babies back on the land, right? Because they got us going to the hospitals. They got us believing that that's where we need to be. They got us, standing up trying to give birth. They got us laying on our backs trying to give birth, like so I was really fortunate to be able to have two home births and having five children. I just had a lot of experience and thought, hey, I could probably offer some help in some way. So I became it's called an Ungwahonwe full spectrum doula. And to tell you the truth, I haven't even been able to really be in my practice with that. I guess maybe I should take that back because I've been in practice with the land and really learning how to be a doula in another way, actually, now that I think about it.
I'll ask you another question instead. But this is for G. I didn't have a chance to ask you this, but you work in the education space a lot. You did a lot of curriculum, so we talk about land-based knowledge and how impactful that is for the climate justice movement. I just wanted to see, could you explain a little bit more about that work you've done, but also kind of the importance of seeing it play out within of that work?
Yeah, so I have worked for the last couple of years with the Lenape Center, working with Lenape elders to build out curriculum centered around story, and also in that curriculum, not only sharing Lenape stories, but also ensuring that students begin to build a practice of incorporating storywork into their own lives. A big part of this, though, in addition to that, is continuing to center the Lenape within specifically students in K-12 spaces in Kianna. And so something that we've worked on a lot is building in Lenape language into all of our curriculum. I specifically worked on pre-K to second grade student curriculum development, and we did this through song, through short stories, through a narration of a bird, and I think that it's been transformative in classrooms because we're now hearing young students able to plant to a tulip tree and use the Lenape word, so tulip, while speaking of it, right, or to going on the walk through the park. So that it's been transformative in that way, while also recognizing that this is a really small step, and it's sort of in a microcosm, and that's sort of something that if anyone hears familiar with Cornell already talks about in his transformational Indigenous pedagogical model, of sort of like moving through this pyramid transformation in education and in educational spaces, and how settler teachers are need to be okay with being uncomfortable if we're going to get anywhere. Otherwise, they continue to just perpetuate violence and in their classrooms, but also beyond, because these students then become adults, and then these adults continue on in that cycle. And so that's part of the curriculum work that I've done behaviors. And I'm very grateful to have had these connections with Kianna, who's also repatriating Lenape blue-corn seeds in Lenape Open, which is really important. And I've also, now with Start Empowerment, have been developing curriculum with Kianna, which is exciting, and we're continuing on and making sure that our work goes beyond, just these sort of like overlays of understanding, but rather like centers and was written by Indigenous folks, while also making sure that settler teachers are forced to reckon with this, because there is a privilege of being a settler that shouldn't exist, where they don't have to confront any of their own histories, and building out a curriculum that's for students, but is just as much for their teachers, because they have to learn through what they're teaching, and hopefully that will just be a very small thing in what needs to be a much larger event.
When I contacted G about being in this conversation, in this panel, I think one thing that they really kind of have a little worried about is like interrupting the space, especially not being Indigenous. And I just wanted to say that non-Indigenous people speak a lot in making the land better, helping Indigenous people, so that solidarity. And us as Indigenous people too, us, we're going through our own struggle. We show solidarity, identities, be that Black identity, Indigenous communities beyond our state. So it's really, so solidarity across our community effort to be able to tackle issues that are and I don't know if you guys have noticed this trend, or I actually intended for this to happen, is that our panelists we have virtually, they're talking a lot about their work in their own homelands. I really wanted to have G on here just to say how it may not be, like you said, it's a small test step. And there's a lot of work to do, but there is work being done when it comes to educating youth justice inside of the Indigenous perspectives. But back to our online panelists.
You can ask a question.
Ask a question? Okay. So my question is, what is it like, what have you found most difficult working on the community? In your community, I know I've been seeing some things going on legally on your Facebook page, which is a couple weeks back, but I just wanted to know if you have any, I feel that's always a hard part when I talk about organizing, talk about working with Indigenous communities. I talk to Indigenous organizers themselves, and they're like, the hardest part is working with my own people. So I just want to know if you have any stories or any things to talk about with that.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So, back home in Akwesasne, the New York State land claims is happening, and this doesn't only affect Akwesasne. We have 7 sister Mohawk territories, and so it affects every single one of our territories as a people, as a collective, as a nation. And right now we're up against New York State, and they are trying to basically make us buy back our ancestral lands, not only our ancestral lands, but this little triangle that's currently in Akwesasne, and then some more lands that are outside the reserve, but are still basically within land claims and still technically ours. It's just, it's when we fall into being federally recognized, right? And that's another thing that I wanted to talk about, because a lot of our people our Oglahoma people are kind of, because of colonialism, all of that stuff, we're kind of brainwashed to believe that we need to be federally recognized, right? And that's what the government does to us. That's the oppression. And so we're taught, and what's normalized is that we hurry up, and as soon as we have a baby, we run and get them a tribal ID card because they tell us we can't get health insurance, we can't get all these health services, all of these other things, benefits, all of that without our tribal ID card. And so what happens is when we sign up for those federally recognized numbers and we become corporate Indians, we are willingly giving up our title to the land. And so then New York State has, and the federal government does have jurisdiction over us. And so on most of our territories, we have federally recognized Indians. That's what we have become. And that's the agenda. That's all part of the agenda. And so right now, it's basically fighting against the court systems and telling them that we don't need to buy back our lands. Like, we never gave up our title to the land. We're still stewards of the lands. We're still caretaking our lands. We're still here. We're still doing our ceremonies. We still speak our language. So we're still here, right? And they only want to recognize the federally recognized tribe, the corporation, as authority and not our traditional government. And so there's still a lot of us who aren't corporate Indians, and we still maintain our identity as Ungwahuma people, and that's currently what's happening. So there's going to be land, we're going to be occupying lands. We also have NYPA involved, New York State Power Authority, who are situated on our islands. If anybody's familiar with like the Thousand Islands and all of that in the St. Lawrence River, because we're on the imaginary border of SoCal, Canada, and the United States. We're right there. So our territory goes into Quebec, into Ontario, and into the States. And so Barnhart Island is in the States. And that's where the power authority is. That's where all the towers, and that's where all the electricity comes from. And they owe us billions, trillions of dollars. They have not paid because they're on our lands as far as rent, all of that stuff. And now we're up against, trying to save that and trying to assert ourselves as Ungwahuma people and saying our land is not for sale. It's non-negotiable.
I think so well, and that was one of the things I brought up. Like, if we're able to justify, or the justification of Indigenous peoples is predicated on being able to remove them. And once, as Indigenous peoples, once we, like, the history, at least for my tribe, we're one of the corporate ones.
Yeah, but we're all under duress.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. But the Nat people, the creations of reservations, like when we were forced to walk all the way to Fort Sumner in the Southwest, that was supposed to be a model reservation. That was supposed to be like, okay, this is what we're creating for the Indigenous peoples, and there we suffered a lot. And then they said, oh, you can go back to your homelands, but that's also another reservation. And once you create that reservation, once you create that federal recognition, under all of that legal system, we talked about being under the state, under the federal government. And one of the issues that I brought up is even being able to address issues like this crisis, that in itself is a barrier. And additionally, when it comes to like water rights, if you guys paying attention to Arizona versus navigation, that was another issue we had. Basically, the government saying that, okay, in whatever treaty, maybe 1868 that we signed, we didn't say it was water rights. We didn't say that you were entitled, that we were supposed to give you water rights. Even though we ruined your water resources, we you ruined your livestock, you ruined everything else, like, we're not responsible for it, it's your condition, it's your problem, you deal with it. And then earlier you talked about enrollment systems. Same thing, like when we talk of like, if I were to marry somebody outside my tribe, they'll have to choose which identity they get to have. And more often than not, you're going to go with the ones with most benefits. And if it completes that cycle of like one strap over enrolled and another one form of indigeneity, legitimate. It's a whole process and it's all together. It's a web. It's a quick. Okay, so I have another question for you. I guess anything that we haven't addressed so far, like anything that we haven't talked about, anything that lingering on your mind, big issues, things like that, how you've been really involved in the Palestinian movement. So I'm sure that we're all addressing for you.
Yeah. Yeah, so I actually want to start a little bit from Kianna, and in it she talks about how the Anishinaabe language is a word-based language, right? English is a noun-based language. And so when somebody causes harm, you know, let's say like she talks about an instance of somebody having vandalized his work. In English, we would call them the vandalizer, right? They caused harm, so they're just now this identity. And she talks about how, you know, in Anishinaabe, they vandalized something, but that's not their identity, right? And so, you know, the quote where she's talking about, you know, the identity of a settler, she says, being a settler or a colonizer is not something you are, it is something you do. It describes your relationship to this land and the people in it. Remember that settlers come to impose a way of living on top of the existing people. Settler colonialism destroys in order to replace. If you are going to stop being a settler and start being kin, that's where we start with what you do. And I think that quote is, I think just watching Israel's incessant bombing of Palestinian land, and the reckoning that people have been having with their own understanding of that history, of the present day conditions, is forcing folks to combat what their knowledge is settled. And the fact that that identity can change, and that it's fluid. And I think too that you know, the word genocide is now also something that we're talking about every single day. And I'm really hopeful that because we are having this reckoning about Palestine, that we will now begin having the same reckoning about the land that we're occupying in the, you know, interland. Because, you know, I saw a post today, somebody that said, you know, we're really glad that people are fighting for Palestine and showing solidarity with Palestine in this way. And also, where is the same solidarity to the people whose land we are settled on, to the people whose land we're currently occupying? And it's something that I feel every time I go to a protest, I'm so glad to be with folks who feel the same way, and also so many other settlers who don't even know whose land they're from. And so it feels like a major contradiction. And it's something that I think folks really need to reckon with and really need to combat internally. And the other thing that I want to speak to is like the fact that folks feel like being called a settler is a derogatory term, when in fact it is what you are. Like, you have settled on this land, and you are the one that needs to get over it. Like, you are the one who needs to do the work. in your house or continuing on in your normal day. There's a lot to be like parsed through and a lot of work to be done before getting anywhere close to solidarity.
And then, my last question to you, do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So one thing as Indigenous peoples, we're always asked when after we speak, after we talk about our experiences, we're asked, how do we solve the issue? So I'm gonna ask you that.
Well, my answer to that is what I've come to learn, and in my experience in my community, being on having some experience being on the front lines, and we have a hard time with consensus. We have a hard time working together. We have a hard time being in relation with one another because of the trauma that's happened to us, because of our minds becoming distorted over the years, because of the effects of residential schools and colonization and all of that. Them taking our identity basically. We carry a lot of trauma, and so it's been a really big challenge to get our people to come together and just be of one mind. And it was really hard. It's been heartbreaking at times. I've been, I've kind of grew up in the political side of things, being who my family is and who I come from. And so all the politics and the knowing of my responsibilities as a Kanien'kehá:ka woman and as a mother and all of that was taught to me from a very young age, and that was normal kitchen conversation. So, but it was really heartbreaking to be in these meetings and in these sit downs with my people, especially the elders, and us not being able to get anywhere. And so I knew that I couldn't change anybody, and all I could do was work on myself. And so that's when I decided to kind of, go turn inward and figure out, how am I showing up, and what ways am I the problem possibly, and in all my relationships. And like even with the work that I'm doing now, people say like, well, how can we come? Can we be a part of it? And how can we help? And it's like right now, it's so important that our people have that time and that space to learn about self so that they can stop operating from a place of pain and start operating from their heart space again, so that we can work together. We can come to a consensus as a people, as a nation, as across our mother's back, as a whole Ungwehue people all over. And that's why I say it's crucial time for our people to return to their homelands, to our waterways, and really reconnect with our mother and find ourselves again, so that we can stand up in the ways that's needed, especially with climate change, because it's all a reflection, right? What you see with industry, what's happening to our land and to our waters, that's all the pollution we're putting in our bodies with the foods that they're giving us, that we have to buy. All the contaminated water. A lot of our people in our territories are still on water, boil water advisories, and like the list goes on. And so all I can do is control myself, and kind of like break that from me putting that onto my kids. And I'm raising 6 of them right now, and that's all I can do is show them another way.
I think you guys connected kind of like my last point before the end. My grandmother, Harriet,
Yes.
she was, on my dad's side, my dad's mom. She was really inspirational in the way that she just interacted with people, the families, chosen families, people from different tribes. And one thing that she really taught me, even though I really knew her for about like 10 years, before she passed, was the importance of relationships. Being able to have conversations with them, being able to just talk to respecting, taking care of her children. Those small, menial tasks that happen, those become really important in the end. She's built a legacy within our family, just being that model. I always call her our patriarch. The person that really emphasized family and community, that was willing to be in the kitchen all day, that was willing to be outside talking to other people, to plan family get-togethers, to plan trail rides. I was full of community events. Something that was just one end, we're all community, we're together, respecting traditions. I just want to say thank you to Keith so much for joining us here today, and our other panelists. Hopefully I get to see you in person soon. Yeah. And do you have anything else to say? Any last words before we add?
Oh, you're muted.
You're
Yeah.
muted.
There we go.
Sorry. No, I don't have anything else to say, I don't think, unless there's questions or anything like that.
Let's have questions.
I just wanted to thank everyone for coming, thank you panelists. Thank you for reading an excerpt from the book Becoming Kin. That's actually a book that we are going to be centering for our first book club. So we do have some more events coming up for the rest of May to honor the missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. The next event is May 25th from 6 to 8 p.m. It's a film screening of We Ride for Her. So again, that's May 25th from 6 to 8 p.m. And then we have the launch of Indigenous Sisterhood Book Club, which we will be centering for Korean Kin. So full circle moment there. But we hope to see you at the rest of our events. And Marianne, maybe you want something
We
to
actually
share?
have a couple of events before our movie screening. We have on the 19th Protectors of the Four Directions, where we have a bunch of activists from all over Turtle Island that'll be joining us virtually to talk about their activism in their own communities. And then on the 22nd, we have our very own Austin, who's going to be doing a talk about indigenizing AI. Indigenizing AI. So all about how we can use artificial intelligence to support our communities and bring attention to MMIP. So both of those are going to be really great events. Both of them are going to be available virtually, just like today was as well. So hopefully we'll get to see you at all the rest of our events. And that's it. Thank you all for being here. Appreciate you. And thank you to our volunteers for being here as well. Amazing work. Thank you. Thank you.